Dear Nadia, dear Sharini, dear Utbaf, dear audience, I'm more than happy to welcome you all to our panel discussion today. This year's Republica challenges us to reflect by asking a provocative question: who cares? And we decided to extend this question to India. So, who cares about India?
Well, an easy answer to that could be that he does. Okay, PowerPoint isn't working. Another person who most certainly does care about India is probably him. And I will promise all of you that our guest tonight also does care about India. And I can tell you there's no one in Europe who cares as much about India as this man does. In 2023, half of the Indian population gained access to the internet, making India one of the biggest economies and markets for most social media providers. And this means you have to keep in mind that only half of the Indian population does have access to the internet right now. So there's lots of potential for growth as well. So are these numbers surprising? Probably not for anyone who has been observing India for the past few years. If we look at India and if we follow what is happening in India, we will see that most of those things have been known to people for a long time. We know that in India we have a rising population. We know that in India more and more people are gaining access to the internet, and we know that India is one of the most important markets for most social media providers. And let's be honest, India is so much more than just Bollywood, poverty, and all the other cliches that come in mind to Germans when they think of India. If we just look at some of the events advertised about India in Germany, we can see that most of it is cliched, is stereotyped. And that's why you might regard this event as a kind of invitation. We would like to invite you to take your own imaginations of India and to contrast them with the changes, challenges, and choices of 21st century India. We would like to invite you to debate with us, to discuss India with us, to see how India changed and how India's digital transformation makes a difference. We want you to appreciate the advantages of it with us, to question the drawbacks, and we would also like you to discuss, debate, and be in touch with us. Today's event will be hosted by Nathalie Mayrud. She is a journalist from Mumbai and holds a degree in culture and sociology and Iranian studies, and has been coming all the way from Mumbai to be with us here today. I think there's no one more qualified to host this panel tonight because she has worked extensively on both topics, on India as well as on the digital realm. So please welcome Nathalie with me, who I'm going to hand over the mic to.
Okay, thank you, Jenny, for the introduction. I'm hailing from Munich, not from Bombay, but thank you.
You came from Bombay today.
All right.
Yesterday.
So for our talk, we have invited 3 experts in our field to discuss Digital India with you. Nadia Christina Schneider, I please would like to welcome you to the stage. Dr. Sharini Jagdiani, I please welcome you to the stage. Ulbaf Tiari, I please welcome you to the stage. So I'll give you a brief introduction. So Nadia Christina Schneider works as a professor for Gender and Media Studies at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Her research focuses on media, culture, and society in South Asia. Professor Schneider published, among others, a monography on culture and cultural differences in the Indian media system, an article on systematic approach to media studies in South Asia, and edited books amongst others. Please welcome her. Dr. Sharini Jagtiani is a senior officer for AI and democracy at the German Marshall Fund in Berlin. Her work centers around intersections of emerging technologies and geopolitics with a focus on AI. She holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Oxford, and she has 10 years of experience working in academia and think tanks, including the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, GIGA. Please welcome her. Ubhav Tiwari is the Director of Global Product Policy at Mozilla. He has a law and technology background and is advocating for progressive regulations in the technology sector. Before coming to Germany, he was a non-resident scholar at Carnegie, India, an advisor to the council member of the Digital Equity Accelerator at Aspen Institute. And prior to that, he was working with the public policy team at Google and was a program manager at the Center for Internet and Society in India. Please welcome him. So before we start, we ask our panelists to prepare a 2-minute statement in each, which they can state their perspective on how India has transformed in the last couple of years. And I would like Ubhav to start with it.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'd like to start by very briefly talking about what are the different ways that India has changed in the last 15 to 20 years because of technology. And I think that the answer to that question lies both in the development and wide deployment of technology, such as the availability of India's digital identity project, the Aadhaar, the rapid proliferation of digital payments, which allows individuals to make very seamless transactions with each other in a way that is much easier to understand and interact with than even cards or other forms of digital payments that we are traditionally used to, as well as the proliferation of the internet itself and the way that it has become easy for many individuals in India to access the internet for the first time via mobile phones. And ultimately, what all of these developments have led to is, one, the onboarding of a massive influx of individuals onto India for the first time, often with their mobile phones, which means that a lot of the typical understandings that one would have of how these populations understand technology, adopt digital literacy, and other practices that deal with how to interact with the internet in a manner that is safe and secure. In India, you would find in urban areas there are many individuals where this is much more commonly adopted and practiced, but these are often individuals who first accessed the internet for the first time via computers. Whereas in a lot of other scenarios, when it comes to mobile phones, the typical situations that you expect even in Europe or in the United States, of the problems associated with technology, misinformation, disinformation, the lack of sufficient privacy regulations and privacy practices, techno-solutionism in order to thrust technology in order to solve problems that are deeply societal in nature, are all also very prevalent in India as well. Ultimately, I think the way that India is choosing to adopt technology will set an example for many other countries around the world that are in different stages through this journey, and it's something that many other countries can learn from.
Thank you very much for your input. Sharini, it's yours.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Can you hear me? Yes. So I will echo some of the points raised by Ubhav. One of the key things that India has done over the past many years is launched Digital India, which is sort of an e-governance initiative by the government of India to bring most Indians into sort of the gig economy and the digital economy. And this has included a lot of initiatives, like Ubhav said, digital identity footprints, online payments, and so on. It's important to remember that 60% of Indian population lives in rural areas. And this is a very, very big country. So sometimes digital infrastructure reaches Indians faster than actual physical infrastructure. So for these initiatives, India has kind of made and created an example of building digital bridges between our very vast and diverse population. And one of the things India did to push this idea forward is in its G20, which was held last year, in the sense that India was the president of the G20. And as a part of that G20 presidency, it pushed the idea of digital public infrastructure, which means infrastructure that allows people to access government services through digital means. This has been sort of an example that India is setting not only across and within the country, but also to other developing countries and nations worldwide and the larger global south. And I'll stop there.
Thank you for your input. Nadia, would you like to go on?
Sure. Good afternoon. Thank you for your interest in this panel. Since the economic liberalization in the early 1990s, India has been undergoing a very profound transformation. And the extensive process of medialization and more recently also the increased digitalization of Indian society can be seen both as a result as well as a key driver of this accelerated change, and therefore should be or deserves much more interest in German media and academia, I would argue. However, in addition to a media and digital technology perspective, I would argue that an intersectional perspective is very necessary, especially if we want to understand better which effects of the many dimensions of inequality really impact on the everyday lives of people in India. Let me give you an example. I think in the previous discussion it was mentioned the category of women. So if someone in Germany, for instance, asks about the situation of women in India today, this question is probably based on the assumption that the lived reality is determined by the fact that close to 700 million people are women. However, cis women as well as trans women, their social identities are obviously shaped by overlapping categories such as caste, class, religion, location, gender, sexuality, disability, among others. So I would say and argue that if we want to understand medialization and digitalization, the best way to do it is to look at it through the lens of intersectionality. Thank you.
So we heard now a lot of keywords. Digital India. It's a very diverse society. It's not easy to answer the question for so many different states who are functioning different, who are developed differently. But nevertheless, let's start with the discussion. So Sharini, you highlighted the outstanding speed of development and talked also about Digital India. I want to ask you, is it possible to survive in India without smartphone?
So it is possible more in urban areas because there are other forms of infrastructure that you can rely on to access a bank or a hospital and things like that. But in many parts of rural India, this is probably your best bet to engage with the world outside of you. From the urban Indian perspective, and I just want to caveat here that when we talk about India, we don't talk about one country, we talk about many Indias and many ideas of India. As Professor Schneider highlighted, we have so many different forms of hierarchy in Indian society, caste, class, gender-related differences and so on. But if you were to kind of cast a map on sort of the wider India, yes, you can access the world without a smartphone, but it's becoming increasingly challenging and unlikely. And just kind of to say that most Indians are using and accessing the internet through a phone. They don't have laptops, they don't have computers. So yes and no, and increasingly unlikely. Short answer to your question.
I mean, I think a good example is the pandemic. So if you wanted to get vaccinated in India, you would needed to have a mobile phone number, and this number should have not been registered with anybody else. So this was a very, very tricky situation. I guess in Germany, it would be difficult to ask someone to only register with a mobile number to get your vaccination. So in 2023, India made headlines all around the world that almost half of the Indian population gained access to the internet. The government reports that maybe by 2025, 900 million people could have access to the internet. But there are a lot of discrepancies. Ubav, can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Sure. So I think on the discrepancies, firstly, there's discrepancies in terms of access. The quality of the internet that's available across the country varies wildly between urban areas and rural areas. And despite the Indian government having something called the USOF, or the Universal Service Obligation Fund, which has many billions of dollars worth of money that's been lying in it for close to a decade, we've actually seen the deployment of those funds to bring access and connectivity to rural areas be very sparsely deployed. And even when it has been deployed, it's been a one-off thing where a telecom operator will come in, set up a tower. The tower will work for 7-8 months. When the tower stops working, no one's going to come to fix it for the next tower. And that means that having access to the internet for all of these visions of digital India requires access to reliable internet. And we've also seen instances with India's digital ID project, the Aadhaar, of at least 25 to 30 individuals who may have lost access to their lives because of the fact that they didn't get access to PDS, or public distribution system of essential goods that they would be required to exist. And this happened because when it was deployed, it was presumed that at the point of sale, where the person will ask you to put your fingerprint, that fingerprint will always work, or that machine will always work, or that there will always be internet. India is learning from these lessons. So it has been that laws and regulations have been amended to say offline authentication should be possible. People have been told that you must not deny access to benefits to individuals because this authentication does not take place. And in that iterative process, the people who are paying the price for that iteration are often the individuals who are at the other side of this digital divide. Even in urban areas, in that rapid increase, the point I made earlier about digital literacy is also quite important. Because what's ended up happening is, it certainly happens in my family, and I think I can relate to many other people from India in this room. I'm sure it happens in their family too, is that WhatsApp is a very recent phenomenon. Being a part of 150 to 200 member family groups where the kind of information that's flowing through has very little to do with like actual fact, but just forwards that come from people, impacts our parents, right? And both my parents have master's degrees, went to good universities, had well-paying jobs for their lives. And even there, the level of digital literacy required to process information is at a very far gap from, I think, what we need in order to live in a healthy society. So in that gap, I think rather than just looking at pure numbers of economic growth as well as a number of people on the internet, we must also look at the experience that we have with these technologies. And there, I think India is improving, but has a fair way to go.
Yeah, I remember reading the newspaper about incidents where people do a lot of hard labor work, and at the end, the little scanner, which should recognize your fingerprint, is not able to recognize your fingerprint anymore because the work you have done was so extensive. So, but we heard already, without a phone number, without a smartphone, life is difficult in India. I think in Germany it's much more easier with surviving without. Nadia, what would you say? Is this digitalization including or excluding more people in the Indian society?
I think it has both inclusive and exclusive effects. On the one hand, as was mentioned, many more people, including less privileged and marginalized groups, have more access to information, to services, have also to a certain extent been empowered through the access and participation in digital platforms. On the other hand, we just heard from Udbhav about the persistent digital divide, especially in rural areas, in economically less privileged regions. So there still is a gap, and I think it will take some time, as you also nicely explained. Maybe we should also mention language barriers in regional and local contexts, especially where people speak minority languages and don't have, you mentioned digital literacy, but I think access to languages that are available is still also a problem. And if we talk about inclusion and exclusion, maybe something which is not directly visible is also the fact that digitalization is known to heavily rely on the consumption of energy. So with the very fast digitalization, the energy demand for digital devices and data services has risen very rapidly in India. And the Indian government has announced, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, that it's going to invest much more money in artificial intelligence in the coming years. And we all know that this will rely on even more consumption of energy. So I would just like to draw our attention also to the question of environmental causes and maybe also the nexus between artificial intelligence and a revival of nuclear energy that we could discuss more. So I think the exclusions are the visible ones, the direct ones that we addressed already, but there are many other impacts where I would really like to see more research and more attention being paid to by the media as well.
I mean, at least if we talk about the Indo-German field, I mean, there's a lot of bet on green hydrogen. And also during G20, there were a lot of discussions. But at the end, it was difficult to find a stronger language. This is what we're seeing. Because, I mean, it's difficult to bring all on the same boat.
Yeah, and I think the secret zone around an open debate on nuclear energy also persists.
True. I mean, there are some factors why sometimes India prefers to talk with France instead of Germany, because France has nuclear power and Germany exited the nuclear power. Coming back to Germany, Utbaf, so you're a person who migrated to Germany. Are you sometimes surprised by our analog lifestyle? So, I mean, our ID has very few functions and paying digital is now slightly picking up. In India, on the other hand side, you have the Aadhaar system and you have the UPI. Can you tell us a bit more about that? How advanced is it and how much is Germany maybe lacking back?
Sure. I think it's really interesting, right? Moving to Germany, what it made me the most cognizant of was the amount of class privilege that I had when I was in India. And the class privilege, the way that it's reflected in digitization is a really interesting concept in India. It took me 15 minutes to get my Aadhaar when I first got it 8 years ago. I had to turn up with 2 other forms of ID, give it to them. They took down the details that was there in that ID, and since then I have an Aadhaar. Whenever I type that number and press enter and type in an OTP that comes to my phone, those details are reflected wherever they have to. So identity as a problem is solved. That was not the experience of a lot of people I know personally, because their information was a little different in different ID documents, because at the time at which the onboarding was done, the sensors weren't working properly. And the experience that those individuals have had with the system and I have had with the system are radically different. And the reason I think it's really important is I think in Germany, things take much longer and it's much more of an issue of availability of appointments and slots, and it's an organizational people I think it's a resource personnel driven thing rather than would technology make this necessarily much easier. I recently got married and my partner is going to be moving to Germany, and one of the documents that has to be submitted back home in India is my house registration certificate that says that this is the address at which is regulated. I can get that in 2 minutes online on the Berlin government website with my ID card that I have here, which is the same kind of ID card that most of us have. This ID card is infinitely more safe and secure than the way that that India uses Aadhaar. It allows my phone to serve as an authenticator. It doesn't need my fingerprints. There are ways for me to establish and set up a PIN that allow me to perform a lot of digital transactions in a way that is infinitely better than the way that they happen in India. Is it as safe? Is this much safer than an SMS? Absolutely. Is it as fast and as easy as having an SMS? Definitely not. I had to wait for 4 months to get an appointment, to get the PIN, to start using this card, right? And that's the reason I think these differences are really, really important, because I think that in the journey to digitization, Germany also needs to figure out what are the ways in which it's not just okay to make something digital. People have to be able to use digital things. And the more you involve people in that process, in an economy that in some ways is constrained with human labor and with human resources, then automatically time will get added to that process. And it requires, I think, a change in how society views certain things as well. Like certainly some of the data protection forms that I fill in Germany are very annoying. No one ever reads them. People just sign them. And things end up happening in the same way anyway. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't exist. Because I do think that in Germany's very strong interest and focus on data protection, and between India's almost lack of interest in data protection, that there is probably a ground that is probably a little more towards Germany that needs to be struck, which shouldn't be a burden upon people when they use technology. The fact that this card works the way that it does is something that the designers of the card came up with. And as long as we keep that design in mind of making it like just as much privacy and security, ease of use and ease of access is as much a criteria, I think Germany could like definitely both emulate a lot of what India has done, but also do things in its own way, which would probably be better as well.
Maybe it's a wrong imagination, but the Aadhaar card, you can just get it printed. So if I forget my Personalausweis, no chance. But in India, you can go to the next copy shop and print out your Aadhaar card.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that, like, and this is a point that we very briefly touched on earlier on digital public infrastructure as well. So what India is now doing is like India would actually love it if the world adopted technology the way that India did. It's something called the India stack. There's the Aadhaar, there's digital payments, and then there's services built on top of that, which is how it operates in India, that they actually want to send it to other places in the world. It's become a UN initiative now. They use their G20 like really well. So from an export idea, like when you export ideas, it's actually happening in India right now, that they are going around the world selling their idea to different people. But I would also encourage you to just take a look at the countries that are actually adopting them and look at the socio-political context in which these technologies are being exported, because there things will be like, there are like, India is both much better, and the risks that we've identified in India would probably be magnified in many of these countries too, but no one's really talking about them.
We talk now about Aadhaar, but there's also UPI. I think UPI, maybe for a German audience, it's a bit like PayPal, but you don't need to have PayPal to use it. So don't you think that's a great advantage?
Yes, but and in fact, like I would say, the way that the UPI system is designed is actually like beautiful from a communication design perspective, because it's like having an email ID. And the reason is that whenever you get a PayPal account, the difference between a UPI ID and a PayPal ID is that a UPI ID is like email, in that anyone can send money to anyone else with a UPI ID, whereas in PayPal, you can only send money to someone else who has a PayPal account. So it's interoperable. It's an open network where banks and other financial systems and regulators can participate. That's a design decision that could very easily be adopted in any country in the world. It hasn't been so far because the banks have refused to cooperate with a central regulator to create such a system, because when such a system exists, you can't charge people money for sending money to other people anymore. PayPal charges you a certain percentage to send it back to your bank account, and like all of these things, there are like power structures in economies that prevent easily usable technology from being deployed, because then certain powerful people somewhere make lesser money. The reason we overcame that was the powerful people in India got together to create this, because they thought that they will make more money when people use digital infrastructure than they will by charging people transaction fees for individual transactions. And ultimately, like if we want to do that, the UPI design system is available on the internet. Any country could adopt it, but overcoming those power structures, I think, is the harder part.
I think it's not necessarily a question if we want that, but if our banks want that. So, Sharini, how well equipped is society for this kind of digitalization? Where do you see challenges?
So there is sort of a vast wave of digitalization, and now we have all these infrastructures in place, including digital public infrastructure. But I think some of the key challenges that have already been mentioned in the group are the lack of digital literacy. Family WhatsApp groups are just a perfect example of the kind of news that can travel without proper fact-checking in place through qualified people. But the other aspect is that because there are so many Indians now on the internet, they really don't know how to consume that news. So the digitization really hasn't been backed up with a public education initiative to actually teach people how to become careful consumers of news. And in a society in which WhatsApp is so easily pushed out, I mean, you've got Meta, they're really banking on the Indian market. These things spread like wildfire, and this has resulted in all kinds of consequences, societal consequences, political consequences. Political parties are mobilizing fake news to spread their ideologies and ideas. So this has also resulted in misinformation, disinformation. The other thing that was also mentioned was the lack of data privacy regulation. I was in an interesting India-Europe digital trade exchange, and it was so interesting. The Indians were on one side and Europeans were on the other side. Funnily enough, I was representing the European side, and the conception of privacy is so different from how it's seen here in Europe and it's seen in India. And that also translates onto the digital stage. So the European idea of GDPR is seen, which is the data protection regulation that we all know, it's seen in India as stifling for businesses. And this is worrying because that has other implications on privacy, because India seems a little apprehensive of copy-pasting the GDPR regulation system for its own data privacy regulation. So there is something new that is coming out in India on data protection, but it really is kind of sidelining the privacy aspect of GDPR. So I would say, just to summarize, the lack of regulation or the lack of interest in regulation, and also the lack of digital literacy. These, in my view, are the main challenges.
I mean, on the other hand side, if you follow debates, there are often debates between the Indian government and companies like Meta on certain kind of regulations, on the questions on influence. And I mean, these fights are fought. So it's at least something that we're seeing.
Yeah.
When we talk about the society, of course, we also need to talk about marginalized groups. Nadia, what are the impacts of the digital trends that you see?
I think that's a very interesting question. On the one hand, we can observe how especially digital platforms have energized urban-based social movements that are, for instance, fighting against gender-based or caste-based discrimination. But then on the other hand, you have an example such as Ekta Parishad, which is really a mass-based movement of many people fighting for land rights, but mostly outside the metropolitan centers. And it has been extremely difficult for them to get media or digital visibility, and I think also for their many participants to interact and participate in these digital platforms. So, and in general, I would say if you think of the vast array of digital platforms, apps that are available, and not only in English but in many Indian languages, some also catering to local or regional audiences, there is actually very little research. So we need much more empirical work on exactly the question to really find out more about these interactions that you mentioned, not only with focus on marginalized or less privileged groups, but I think society in general.
I would agree on that. So if we have a look at another group of women, have there been only positive impacts on women? Like, I mean, you need to imagine there has been a push in India for banking accounts. So in India, it's easier to get a bank account than in Germany. So in Germany, if I don't have an address, I don't get a bank account. If my address is not verified with the post and I have a bank account with Postbank, they freeze your bank account. In India, sometimes people have very interesting addresses around the corner next to Good Luck Hotel, the 5th lane, and still they can access bank accounts, which was very important also for women. The mobility is less for women because if only one person has a vehicle in the house, it's most of the time the father or the son. So you can see through this digitalization, it was also a window to the world for women. But are all these developments only positive for women? Sharni, what would you say?
So yes, on the one hand, digitalization has given women a voice. It's given women a bank account, things that they would not have had access to earlier without it. But at the same time, the same example that you said about vehicles also translates to gadgets. So in many parts of India, if it's a one gadget household, it's very likely that that gadget belongs to the father or the brother or the son. So yes, a woman may be able to access and have her own bank account, but the access to the gadget in and of itself is a challenge. And there was a study that I read about sort of the fact that women are much less likely to own the gadget and thereby as a result, less likely to access internet services. So yes, there has been an effort towards kind of giving women a voice through digitalization, but that also needs to be kind of followed up with a system that gives women access to gadgets and using them. So twofold.
I think the pandemic was a big push because suddenly it was not only the father who needed a smartphone, it was also all the children who needed smartphones. But we talk about this later. Ubrav, so which of India's most problems can be drastically mitigated or at least improved through digitalization?
I would say in descending order, the first is definitely healthcare. India as a market has been one that has a very, very large informal healthcare sector, to the point at which I would argue that most individuals who access healthcare in India do so either via government-run hospitals, where rather than insurance covering your fees, it's the fact that it's the hospital where the fees are much lower, covered entirely by the hospital, or through individual payment, which is private payment. And the reason, and therefore the number of people who actually, have the Western notion of healthcare, which is health insurance, different kinds of health insurance covering you, is actually quite the minority in India. And there are some interesting government programs that are beginning to change that now. And people are also realizing that when it comes to healthcare, from getting the ability to have like virtual consultations to perform an initial triage to determine what kind of like help and assistance you need, to digital health records and many things like that, all are things that are being promoted quite heavily in India, and there is a possibility that it would have quite a radical positive potential. There are lots of negative drawbacks to it as well, because a lot of the people who are doing this development also want access to this healthcare data so that they can use it to like train people to like train an AI model to detect like lung cancer, for example, better. Some of the most impressive like technologies that Google has worked on for diagnosing diabetic retinopathy just from scanning someone's eyes, the entire model was built in India, in Tamil Nadu. So that's just an example to showcase where there is a lot of potential. There's also a lot of drawback because it's some ways considered a little bit of a free for all, but there's definitely a lot of positive potential there. Agriculture as well. India's agricultural sector is largely informal, and because of that informality, a lot of things that just require information sharing either don't take place at all, or even that information sharing is gate kept by intermediaries in the ecosystem. So imagine the government wants to notify a new scheme, or send out weather alerts in a particular way, or send out flood warnings. It's only now that a lot of the systems are being built where people can be reached directly via their cell phones, or that in village panchayats there would be centers where information will be broadcast centrally so that everyone can have access to it. And this is before getting into like more advanced technologies helping Indians in agriculture as well. Right now it's much more of a transparency, making sure people have access to information, and if they are being treated unfairly, so if they are being paid lesser than what they are by a shop, it's easier for them to find out it's happening and have a recourse, are some of the ways in which technology could help.
I mean, I did an interview a few years ago with a startup, and they wanted to digitalize blood banks in India, because I mean, it's really the question, where is what available? And I think healthcare definitely, and also agriculture, are points where it can be very profitable. But to come back, how well do the digital solutions offered by the Indian government address these problems? Or do they need more cooperation with companies?
So I don't think any of the things that we have discussed in this panel are government-based technology innovations. Like, what is happening in India is that there is a private sector. The private sector comes up with the technology, the whole technology, not just the code, the design, the specification, the plan for how it should be rolled out. And then one of two things happen. A, the government either finds another partner, which is like an implementing partner, gives the contract to them, does an RFI, and it gets implemented. Or the government rubber stamps what this private sector or consortium has come up with anyway, and then that ends up being deployed with government resources in-house. And what that is leading to, and like from the time that I did public policy in India, it's quite like evident, is that there's a huge gap between the people who have to create, design and implement these technologies at a very high level, and then the government that's responsible for these technologies existing in the real world. Which is why there have been instances of like government officials typing out their Aadhaar number on the internet, on Twitter, saying, hack me. You can't hack me, when on the day that the UADI, the India's digital ID, said you shouldn't do that, it's really unsafe. And this person headed this same authority before that, right? And that's just an example of how like the level of understanding is probably not commensurate with the level of responsibility. And I don't think that that's a problem that's unique to India. If you walk into Washington, D.C. and go to the Hill and talk to people in the Senate or the Congress or the FTC, they will all tell you that for every one person they have, there are 100 people on the other side in the technology companies who understand the technology better. So in general, I think it's a problem that we are grappling with as a society of how to regulate things that we do not fundamentally understand. In India, especially given the scale of the solutions we are deploying, I think that problem in some ways is actually being amplified.
So, Sharini, is then digitalization something just happened to India, or is there a bigger plan from the government, and how much does this bigger plan result in the development?
So, given how it was implemented, it would be quite surprising to say that there wasn't a plan in mind or a grand strategy. Like Uptav said, there was a India stack that came up, and then you need your Aadhaar. On top of the Aadhaar card, you have digital payments. On top of the digital payments, you have documents that can be validated. On top of those documents that can be validated, you can actually manage those documents using India stack. So it's hard to actually say that this wasn't envisioned. But that being said, it was essentially public-private partnership. And this is not unique to just Digital India. This is how India has worked through the history of time since independence era. You look at sort of how India has engaged in its developmental infrastructure outside of the country. It has always been public-private partnership. So yes, the private sector comes, invents a technology, and then the government kind of takes over from there. But at the same time, it is very much also the government kind of coming in and setting up a grand strategy. But that being said, we've discussed on end, there are a lot of challenges. And it doesn't mean that the regulation has followed sort of what has been developed. And that's largely because what is being developed at a scale and pace that's unprecedented.
I mean, especially if one of you had Googled before Aadhaar. I mean, it's interesting for the people who went before with the Aadhaar development team and then switched to private companies and had very big ideas how to use the Aadhaar. Udbhav, if you were to advise the Indian government, what would you try to improve?
That the internet is probably, I would say, after our demographic dividend and the large percentage of our population that is familiar with English, I think the biggest asset that we have as a country. Unfortunately, I think, like in many other countries in the world, the direction in which the government is deciding to utilize the internet, while also it certainly encourages economic activity. So why were digital payments done? They were done so that more people can transact more easily with each other. But I think it's also being used slowly as a vector to control what society can or cannot think about certain topics. And India historically, I think, has had, honestly, given the diversity and complexity of the country, a pretty positive free speech ethos. And a lot of that ethos is being implemented on the internet in ways that are mind-boggling, right? So, for example, if the Indian government has to ban a book, there is a law that says this is how books are banned, and this is the list of banned books. Same goes for movies, same goes for lots of other pieces of culture. The committee that decides what content needs to be blocked in India on the internet, and the links of that content and the reasoning behind why that content is blocked are all confidential. You cannot know that this content has been blocked in India officially. Some platforms choose to tell people anyway, but even then they are obliged by law to not tell them why. And if you notice here, we are I'm not even saying that the government should not block content. I'm saying that if you are blocking content, you should have a reason for why you do so. People should be able to understand it. There should be a list maintained so people can take it to court if they have to challenge it. So the way that we are dealing with the complexity of the internet is to hide behind its complication and say, we just know better, you must listen to us, rather than engaging on the merits on which it could have happened. Which, I mean, I understand why and I don't think it has anything to do with just the current government, by the way. A lot of the laws that work this way were passed even before the current government was in power in India. So it's much more an outlook issue, and I think the greater and the better we can figure out how to balance those two interests, and in some level I think it requires law changes, in some levels it requires courts to step in, but also for people to care. The average Indian doesn't really know or care about the fact that any of this is happening, and until they do, I don't think there will be impetus to improve.
I mean, it's actually also difficult to know that. So the thing is just if you watch some movies on streaming websites, you sometimes feel like, oh, was their scene cutted? I mean, this is, I think, one of the most examples or most common examples where you understand, okay, something has happened here. Otherwise, it's difficult. Nadia, India has changed a lot in these recent years. How did these developments impacting us in Germany?
That's a great question. I think India already had and now really has a big presence, major presence, I would say, in Germany, be it in the area of economic, cultural, academic, research corporations. I think currently close to 250,000 Indian citizens are living temporarily or permanently in Germany, and this does not include German citizens of Indian origin or with family connections in India. So I think these are excellent prerequisites to think together about a successful coexistence. But in order to do so, it would be necessary to also make this more visible. And I think there are certain gaps where you see this actually, this presence, and how it's not being discussed and debated. And very occasionally you would find newspaper articles, for instance, about the situation of Indian students in Germany, what they feel like. So I think much more care should be given and paid to that, because it's already there. Also, if you look at translation of literature, streaming services, the amount of cinema productions in many Indian languages that are available through Netflix, Amazon Prime, and there's a growing interest in Germany. You showed a slide in the beginning. I think the times when German audiences only knew about Hindi cinema, aka Bollywood, are over. They know about Telugu cinema, they're interested in Tamil cinema. So to a certain extent, there is also a lot of competence, which is not visible in the feuilletons, strangely enough, I think. And it would be great to create more spaces for conversation about that, I think.
Yeah, and because we care, the last question goes to you. If you were advised to the German government, how can Germany become better prepared for the 21st century India?
Two things. Again, by thinking also about the Indian diaspora in Germany and see it as a very important bridge. And the second thing, especially if you compare with China and the role of China studies, contemporary China studies in German academia, it's striking how much research and teaching on contemporary Indian society, economy, culture is neglected. And the situation could even get worse because of budget cuts and department closures. So actually we're not in a good situation, not only with regard to India, but also other important South Asian countries. So if I had the luck to talk to government representatives, I would really request them to halt this development and invest more in the academic work that we need to do more research, do more empirical work, and to increase the knowledge communication, knowledge transfer in order to create the visibility that I mentioned before.
I think I just can agree. I'm not sure what's the other ones. Could you agree to that?
I think as an academic myself, I would agree a lot. There are very few institutions in Germany that not look at India from a very sort of contemporary lens, contemporary foreign policy. It's more sort of humanities and earlier part of India, which is, I mean, wonderful, but we could also supplement that with a more contemporary reading of India and also more resources available for Indian students to come on exchange to German universities as one myself. I actually really enjoyed having those exchanges. So completely endorse your comments.
I guess we can agree more exchanges needed. The thing is also I came to India with an exchange, and I also see here a lot of people I met through exchanges, which is very great. Thank you all for joining us here. And now I would open the floor to you. Do you have questions for us? Is there anyone who would like to ask a question?
Yeah, can you hear me? Oh. Yeah, thanks a lot for your talks. Very interesting. I would like to know a little bit more about digital public infrastructures because as far as I can see, it's promoted very successfully by the Indian government, but it has not been fleshed out very much. So I think it's more of an intellectual concept than very much implemented, apart from UPI and other forms of DEPA systems. So do you really think it's an alternative to big tech platforms, private big tech platforms like the GAFAM platforms as we know them? Or are there some problems also in this interaction between public and private players? Because, for instance, UPI is used and you've got many apps, but it's, as far as I know, 40% is Google Pay and 40% is PhonePe. So there is almost a duopoly also, even though you've got a public infrastructure. So is it really an advanced concept which can be exported, or is it more an concept, an idea?
Udbhav?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. So I think there's like a practical answer which I can give, like in terms of how it's being exported and why, while it may seem generally a concept that only exists as a vision, there are actually many technical components to that are available for governments to pick and deploy. I'll talk a little bit about also the aspect of like safeguards within the DPI, but I think there are actually others on the panel who could talk a little more to like the kind of geopolitical lens with which India is doing it, because I think that's also quite important to understand why it's happening. On the kind of more practical notions, which I'll say very quickly, the digital public infrastructure is fundamentally based on the premise that countries can do their digital growth trajectory on the same premise that India did. The first there was digital identity. So there is something, a project called MOSIP, or the Modular Open Source Identity Project. It's based out of Bangalore. It's at IIT Bangalore, Indian Institute of International Technology, Bangalore. And it's essentially an open source code base to run your own digital identity project. It's not like the Aadhaar in that it can be run with ID cards. It doesn't require only biometrics. And is a way for other governments to be able to roll out digital ID programs more quickly with an open source project. So that's a lens that's already been adopted in, I think, at least 8-9 countries at a different stage, and that list is going to grow pretty quickly. And then after that, for all of the other concepts, it's mostly memorandums of understanding with the NPCI, which is the National Payments Corporation of India, which runs the UPI network, and different digital banking regulators or banking regulators in these individual countries. If you would like to track how this is actually happening in practice, there's the Digital Public Goods Alliance, and they have I think, 50 in 5 project, which is having 50 digital public infrastructure projects in 50 countries in the world in 5 years or something like that. I may be getting some of those numbers wrong. So their website has also a lot of the forward-looking vision of how these things are being implemented. But the drawback is that there isn't as much attention being placed on safeguards in these contexts. Mozilla used to work on India's digital ID project, the Aadhaar, a fair bit, and it took a lot of conversations between us and many other allies who were very closely involved. For the World Bank, for example, to start considering the state of data protection regulations before it starts investing in projects that are digital identity related around the world. And this was one of the reasons why many countries on the African continent passed data protection laws, was so that they could get World Bank funding to do digital identity projects. So that's an example of the way in which this pressure can serve as a positive force to bring protections that don't already exist, but it's also a sign that the people who are selling all of these ideas are not really necessarily asking the really important questions of how will this technology be implemented in the unique social context of a country. What if the MOSIP database is taken and one of the entries that's added to it is ethnicity, and that is used as a way to inflame the tensions that already exist in certain countries, is a question that obviously the person who's building the technology doesn't want to think about it, because then they can't sell their technology to anyone because everything is unique. Governments don't want to think about it because they want to control and they have power. So in that private public like juxtaposition you give, I think it's about who you trust more. There are many things for which I trust Google and Facebook more than I trust my own government, and there are many things for which I trust the Indian government more than I would trust these smaller like platforms. So I think it's cause and effect kind of like situation, but I would rather have a baseline of protection that equally protects me against both at a bare minimum.
Sharini, would you add something?
On the
Briefly.
geopolitical side, I mean, one of the things that, when you look at India at the world stage, you kind of have to see that India has always been aspiring a larger role. It has been a status-seeking country for the longest time, even when it came as an independent country and then had to survive the world after it. And digitization is really seen as one of those things that can bring India on the world stage. India is also living in a world in which there is geopolitical competition between itself and China. India is also living in a world in which there is a wider geopolitical competition between the United States and China. And in that world, India wants to be seen and wants to have a voice. So a digital agenda is a very key part of that. And digital public infrastructure becomes a way in which India can export its global brand. And that's sort of why this impetus is there, even without the right data protection in place.
Thank you for your input. So we have 3 minutes left for more questions.
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. I look at it as a kind of competition. You have the single digital market concept in Europe, and everything we talk about, AI regulation, GDPR regulation, is in reality a regulation for the single digital market. And then you have the digital public infrastructure of India, which is another model, but it creates a digital wall around the market, the same way as in Europe. And you have MOSIP and the World Bank, which promote actually the Indian model with a little bit of a cherry on top, which is GDPR. So how is this competition going to end?
Okay, we take one more question.
Very simple. Very simple question. Who cares about privacy in India? Who is really protecting it nowadays in this overall setting?
Okay, one last question, the chance.
Thank you very much. One short question about the religion and the role in politics and in the society. This was very nice.
All right. So we answered the two first question. Who wants to start?
Privacy, I think it's the people, some sections of Indian society who care about privacy more than others. The government still needs to kind of get on that page. But yes, it's more the people of India who are aware of their rights. And again, that's a small section of Indian society. So that would be my short answer to the question.
Would you briefly answer the first question?
Sure, yeah. I can also combine it with like the privacy and who cares about privacy. So in choosing the two markets between the European like model and the Indian model, India is actually trying to carve what it's calling the fourth path, where it takes part of the American, part of the Chinese, part of the European models and say, this is the way that we would like to govern ourselves. And many other countries are actually looking at it as the way that technology should be developed in the global majority and should be regulated in the global majority, which is not focusing as much as Europe does on regulation, neither letting the private sector do everything that it does in America, nor letting the state have absolute control like it does in China. And at sometimes, like, I don't think the Indian government has ever specifically articulated in this way, but they've definitely used the term the fourth way or the fourth path many times, like in their past. And I think that they are doing that in order to break that dichotomy of saying, like, should it be us versus them? They're saying our model is a model that works for us, so we want to create that model which doesn't treat privacy as importantly or gives or defers to the state for what privacy should mean to its individuals and to its citizens. And ultimately, I think it depends on the country where this model is taken and how that back and forth ends up playing out. Certain countries like Kenya, for example, has privacy in its constitution, but it took a legal challenge for its digital ID program for them to have a data protection law. India didn't have privacy in its constitution, and the Indian government fought in the Supreme Court for the fundamental right to privacy to not exist under the constitution and lost that case. And then we finally got a data protection law last year after 6.5 years. And all of these, I think, are just systems of this process playing out where ultimately there isn't any very clear answer. But if you were to ask the Indian government who will win, they will say they have already won because they've managed to create this idea that there is a fourth way that other countries are adopting via projects like the DPI.
So if you have more questions, feel free to join us. And also for the question on politics, I want to make some advertisements. So today at 4:15 at the home base, we have a meet-up to the Indian elections. And we're inviting you all to join us and be happy to talk more about this topic. And if you're lucky, maybe our speakers have now a bit of time. Thank you very much for Dunya to help with all this preparation. I hope we could give you a bit more insight into India. And we are looking forward to have more stages, to have more get-togethers where we can exchange, because this was just a short touching of a few points.